All right. Today we're very fortunate because, for two reasons. Number one, we have Paul Kahn as our guest, who has an enormous amount to tell us about something that is of great interest to you. And that number two is experience design, experience mapping, and this sort of thing, which will constitute your fourth and final assignment. So I encourage you to stay tuned for the presentation and also our conversation afterwards. Paul has been working professionally with digital information for many years, specializing in large information problems. The name for what he does keeps changing. Hypertext research, information design, digital design, information architecture, user experience, but whatever we call it, the work always has the same focus: shaping and designing collections of digital information to improve user experience. He looks for the difference that makes a difference, the threshold of acceptance, the patterns that connect people to the information they need. Paul joined MadPow after a decade working in the design community of Paris, France. He created the first agency in France focused on information architecture and taught the subject in several professional master's programs. His portfolio includes clients in the biomedical field, literary publishers, large cultural institutions, and international corporations in the US and Europe. On both sides of the Atlantic, he has been a thought leader in his field, developing many of the visualization techniques used in information architecture practice through his collaborations with Christoph Lenk, with whom he co-founded Dynamic Diagrams in Providence, Rhode Island. Whether he is playing with computers or not, Paul is a writer, a reader of books, and a traveler. He writes scientific and design books, journal articles, and conference papers, as well as poetry, fiction, and essays on visual art and literature. Please join me in welcoming Paul Kahn.
First thing I need to do is take your picture, so when somebody asks me what I was doing today, I'll be able to say, look, I was talking to all these people. Right? There we go. Smile. There we go. Okay. So I was asked to come and contribute to this course. It was really interesting to learn about such a course where you've had the opportunity to listen to people from many different fields discuss design. And I'm hoping that those of you who are not studying design can understand from what I'm going to talk about today and from what you've heard in the other weeks, how it really does have to do with business and engineering and architecture. It is quite a continuum. Experience design, or UX for short, is perhaps the most recent addition to the design vocabulary. It's certainly current to be involved in experience design. So the question always comes up, what is experience design? And so I'm going to give you a nice set of bullet point definitions. Experience design is user-centered. So there's a rather broad tradition of the idea of user-centered design. This may seem self-evident, but there's a lot of design that isn't design. You're not designing for the user, you're designing for the machine, or you're designing for the political system, or you're designing for the material. In experience design, the point is that you're starting from designing for the user. This presumes that you know who the user is. So as I'll describe a little bit later, you need to do a certain amount of research to identify who the user is, what they're doing. And so when we're talking about designing, we're trying to design for that experience as it looks to the person who's using the product. Experience design is co-creative. This is also one of the distinctions that's come out of the practice. It's always been the case that when you're working for a client, you have meetings and you talk to them and find out what are their issues, what are the goals. But in experience design, we try and emphasize this notion of co-creation, and that co-creation might involve stakeholders. When I would do this in France, I'd have to translate what a stakeholder is. Like, what does that mean? They've got some kind of a piece of iron in their hand and they're walking around. The definition simply is, if you're working in a business process, there are certain people within the organization where the work that you're doing, it affects their job. So these are the stakeholders. When you're brought in to do a project, you have to identify who has the most direct relationship to the project. And we try to involve them in the design process. We try to create workshop situations where we draw out of them what their ideas are, and we try to use those ideas as part of the results. Experience design is sequencing. It's understanding whatever product you're working on as happening in time. So you may come up with a really beautiful design, but you have to understand, why would somebody arrive at that design? What is that design a stage in terms of a process? So we need to understand the sequence, and we need to understand those sequences in terms of interrelated actions. So when you arrive at this point, where are you in a process? What are you thinking about? What other things might be in the environment around you? So user-centered, co-creative sequencing. It's evidencing. Intangibles. These intangible things should be visualized in terms of physical artifacts. So you want to identify what it is in terms of material, and it's holistic. That you have to do this in terms of the entire environment. And in fact, this is the definition of service design from a very interesting book called This is Service Design Thinking. So my point in using this to define experience design is to say that there's not a significant difference. The main distinction in service design versus experience design is service designers are generally looking at intangible services, whereas experience designers are generally looking at specific applications that they're working on, less intangible, a website, a mobile application, or some combination of those more tangible. But in either case, these 5 principles are the main principles that you're following. So how does that embody itself in terms of the kind of agency work that we do? I work for MadPow. This is an agency of about 65 people. We have an office here in Boston, an office in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and one in Louisville, Kentucky. We provide services to a wide range of clients: financial services, healthcare, technology, media. When we develop a project, we work with this list of services. And every project doesn't involve every one of these services, but this, in a way, is a definition of experience design. A person or a group of people, an agency. I mean, one person could provide all of these services, generally. You have a team of people who are more specialized in one than another. And the first of these is user research. And by user research, we mean when you want to set up interviews, you want to set up a test, you have to understand what do you need to recruit a set of cohorts, how do you define the kind of people that you want to test, how do you moderate and record these types of interviews or tests. There's some very specific psychology behind that, as well as analyzing the results. When you've talked to 20 people or 30 people, you come up with a list of questions, you have 20 different interviews, then you're left with having to read through these 20 or 30 different interviews and come up with a synthesis. You know, what did we learn from these interviews? So the user research is a very important part, because we're presuming that our work is based on what we find in the research. Design studio is a technique that we use related to this idea of co-creation or collaboration. Design studio involves getting a group of people together and identifying, say, a major page or a function in a program that you're working on, and then saying to everybody, you have 5 minutes, draw this. Everybody can draw. Everybody draws for 5 minutes, and then we take whatever you've drawn, and you have a few minutes to explain it to the group, have a critique, everybody thinks about it, and then we do it again. Okay, let's try that again, draw it again. And this type of rapid design and critique with the stakeholders or with users, if you can recruit users to be involved, often brings out some really interesting concepts and is one of the great ways to bring the ideas of users and the stakeholders into the design process. Based on that research and the design studio, we will develop personas, persona being sort of an abstraction of the user. There's 100,000 people we want to use this program. There's 4 kinds of people. So let's describe in some detail this kind of person at this age with this kind of background with these kinds of needs, and then another person and another person, and then develop journey maps, experience maps, that show how that kind of person would experience this particular flow, in order to prove to ourselves that we're accounting for the differences in the people. You know, this might be really attractive to this person, they're not so this other person's not so attracted to that. Do they still get to where we want them to go? From that more abstract level, we'll do wireframes. Wireframing here simply means mocking up the content of the page or the screen without too much, as little reference to visual design as possible, so that when we're discussing it, people don't say, I don't like blue. Like before we like blue or don't like blue, here's what should be on the page, here's how it should work. And then prototype that, either paper prototyping, that is, you don't program it, you just create a sequence of screens, or turn that into HTML or using some other kind of quick prototyping so that we can create a sequence. And with that sequence, we can go back to the user research and we can do user testing and verify or discover that something we thought was really easy seems to be confusing, or something we were worried about, everybody seemed to be able to do it just fine. When you're working on websites in particular, or any large content projects, we also have specialists on content strategy, how the text is written, the relationship between text and image on the screen as it fits into a sequence is sometimes a non-trivial problem. Often you're working with clients where they know what they want on that screen, but when you put it on the screen, no one would ever be able to find what they put on the screen, or no one would actually get to the bottom of the page to read what they need to read. So you need to work with them to come up with a way of shaping that content. And then search engine optimization, SEO, it's a piece of black magic that many clients are very concerned about. Right? If you've just created a new service for delivering food to college students, and you've come up with a name for it, and you're building an application. You want, when somebody goes, I want lunch, you want your service to come up. How do you do that? And often how you do that is related both to the content strategy and how you structure the application. So we provide those kinds of services. And then I like the term creative technology rather than programming. We have a number of developers who are creative technologists. They're well aware of the latest techniques in responsive web design and using HTML5, CSS, what you can do, how you can make things light, fast, effective. And so to create a good experience design project, you need some collaboration between people with all of these different kinds of knowledge. And as I said, some people know all of this, some people know some of it and know how to work with people who know the other parts. Myself, I never studied computer science. I've spent most of my life working with people who know how to program. And those of you who find yourself in that situation, I advise you to know enough about programming so you know when they're lying. That's part of what you need to know as a designer. It's also great if you know how to do it, but if you don't know how to do it, at least understand the principles, and the same vice versa. If you're an engineer and you understand how to make something like this, understand enough about design principles so that when you're working with a designer, you recognize that they know what they're talking about. So I'm going to show you an example application, case study, try and illustrate this more abstract concept. So this is a client we worked with last year. The name of the company is Iverify. We were asked to work with them on a mobile application. They're a small software startup company actually based out in Kansas City, Missouri. And they've developed a technology for recognizing who you are by looking at your eye from your mobile phone. And the main purpose of this is to replace those pesky passwords that you keep forgetting, right? keep going to some place and it asks you for the password, and you're trying to remember which password did I use for this particular place. The idea was, or the idea is, not was, that this technology and software would be integrated into applications. So it's not really an application you'd use by itself, but you would use it for your online banking. You would use it for whatever you're using your mobile phone for that you really need security. So the first thing we had to do was figure out how it works, so we understood who we were working with. I'll just tell you that it works. It seems incredible, but some very clever computer scientists came up with algorithms that read the veins on the sides of your eyes. Actually, they're reading the distance between those veins. Apparently, it doesn't matter how late you stayed up last night or whether you got hit in the face. You can look at the veins on the side of eyes, and they are a unique print. So it's not actually taking a picture of your eye, it's doing what you see down on the bottom. It's creating these patterns and measuring the distances between them, and it requires just a 720 pixel camera, so any of your mobile phones would support this. Apparently it works more reliably than that fingerprint thing that Apple integrated onto their phone. So these people were hoping that they would be able to show this to the world and sell it to Samsung or some other large company. The problem, or the goal of the project, was to give them a more professional look to this application that you needed. The interface for setting up the application increase the probability of success, decrease confusion. So this is a very common theme in experience design. You want things to work efficiently, you want people not to be distracted, you want people not to be confused. Streamline the instruction and the enrollment. Find the best combination of text and image and animation and video and voice to communicate this, because on the mobile phone they were using all of these things. It vibrates, it makes noise, you can see your eyes. They were using all of these things to make it work. So one of the first things that we did was we made this diagram to lay out how the application initially worked. And it was working in a 4-step process. First it gave you instructions. Then it asked you to practice holding the phone in the right place so that it could see your eyes. Then it asked you to do what it called an enrollment step, like set this up. Then a verification step to verify that whatever image it had was correct enough so it could recognize you again. So as you see here, there were a lot of screens. One of the goals here was that you should be able to do this in a minute or so. I mean, how much time do you want to play with your mobile phone when you're not looking at Facebook or reading your email? You don't really want to spend too much time doing things that you're not really interested in. So we were trying to come up with a way of bringing this down. First thing we did was we tested the existing application. So we had a round one where we just wanted to verify, how does it work now? If we don't touch it, first do no harm. Let's see if there's problems here. And we found that everybody was able to use it with only a little bit of trouble. Everybody did like the idea of not having to enter a password or a PIN number. It seemed worthwhile to them. They said that the written instructions and the video that were part of the instruction part were fairly easy to understand, and that holding a hand in front of the face in the initial design, let's see if I can demonstrate this, the major problem was, where are you supposed to hold the phone? Like, am I supposed to hold it here, here, here? And there was an instruction that had you hold your hand like this and put the phone over here, and that's how far away you were supposed to hold it. So this little animation of somebody holding their hand like this in front of their nose and then putting it over here, that seemed to be useful. And participants said something else that we more or less understood, which was that the more you did it, the easier it got. It's that first orientation that was the hard part. So what we did after the research and doing the user test was we took this concept of enrollment and verification and we collapsed it and tried to come up with a different concept of creating the iPrint. Enrollment and verification is something that the programmers understood, but the people who are using it, what is enrollment? What is verification? What are you doing? You're creating an iPrint. So that seemed to help. And we replaced this 2-step process with a single building up. We eliminated this second scan. At one point, the technology required you to look left and then to look right, Turned out they didn't need both. They could build a print by just exposing one side of your eye, so we eliminated that. And we wanted to build into the interface some progress to show the user that the eye print was getting built, and now it was done. So we wanted to reduce that instruction sequence to just 2 animations. There were several more in the original application. And we wanted to focus on this transition from the normal face-to-phone position to the eye print. And this is something that largely came out of looking at the videos of the user research. Those of you who have mobile phones, how many people here have mobile phones? Yes. So when you take your mobile phone out, you generally hold it here, right? Here is some distance between your face and the screen where you can read what's on the screen. And you generally don't hold it here unless you're walking across the street and trying to get killed. You're sort of holding it over here. So there's a normal position. You already know how to hold your mobile phone. And what we decided, what we needed to do is we needed to train people to go from normal to where they had to hold it for this particular application. So we changed the flow. We've got this small instruction sequence at the top, and then you need to position the phone, gaze left, get a match, and then you need to repeat that as you build up the eye print. And we worked out this single animation that you do this repeatedly with the designers and with the client. They didn't really like what the guy looked like. When he started looking like Silver Surfer, they weren't too interested. They had this ponytail girl that they'd used. They liked ponytail girl, but she shouldn't have such large breasts, so you reduce her breasts and everything works out fine. This is the design process with clients. But the main point was we had this silhouette of somebody holding the phone, and the animation simply brought it to a position closer to her face. And that seemed to be the clue within a few seconds that people understood where they were supposed to hold the phone. We also wanted to give reinforcement to the users as to how the software itself was building up the eye. The original sketch you see along the top as the eye illustration filled in, that turned out to be so incompatible with their logo, which they'd gotten from clip art, that we had to can that. It just looked too interesting compared to their logo, so we decided if they liked their logo, we would just use their logo. So the logo itself filled in and built up. So we did a second round of user testing. So we've done this. Can we objectively see that we've done a good job? We found that they were able to use the application with little or no trouble, as they had in the first round. That there was a big opportunity to guide users through the instructions and through a failed eye scan. There is a possibility when you hold it, it doesn't pick up your eye. They said that the written instructions and audio were easy to understand. They got through it easier the more the scans they did, and they did seem to have an easier time with the application than the first time around. So we got some verification for that. And just to give you an example of what I mean by user testing, we do these user tests in a lab with video, and then we go through the tests and we create a test document where we identify what the issues are. We try and illustrate from taking images from the video, and then we also try and quantify the importance of different comments. One of the things that was important in this particular case was some of what we were finding in the user testing had to do with the experience design, the things that we were modifying, and some of the things we were finding had to do with the engineering, which we had no control over. And they were giving us a program, and in the user testing we were finding that the application doesn't notice certain things that people are expecting it to notice. So we had a color coding system here, both the importance of the comments that we were suggesting for changes and also things that we want to call to the client's attention, but they're not things that we can address in the design. So that's the example from Iverify. As I said, I've picked it because it shows this combination of visual design, workflow, user testing, analysis of the user testing. This was all done in about 3 weeks, I think. Often these kinds of projects are done quite rapidly. When you do a project like this, often the thing that takes the most time is recruiting the people for the user studies. So you often need a 2-week, you need a 2-week advance notice to do the recruiting and find people. But you need in an agency setting, you need to be able to pull these types of things together as quickly as possible, pull the right people together to come up with the result. And one result we found was that shortly after we did this company won a large round of funding. So I think their goal was to come up with a more professional presentation of what they were doing, and that seems to have accomplished what they wanted. I wanted to, let's see if I can make this thing a little larger. I wanted to show one other example, as we're going to be talking a bit about experience maps. Yeah. So the idea of journey maps or experience maps is I think it's intellectually it's a really interesting problem, and there's no one way of doing it. Obviously, what I'm showing you here is incomprehensible from wherever you're sitting, but let me try and describe what you're looking at. We did an experiment, this was about 4 years ago, myself and 3 of the people who were working with me. We decided we were really interested in the touch points of the transportation system, particularly multimodal transportation. For example, if you are leaving from here and you're going to take a flight home to wherever you live, and then once you get to the airport, first of all, you have to get from here to the airport. Once you're at the airport, you have to get from the airport to the particular plane. Then from the plane at the other side, you have to find your baggage, and you have to find ground transport, and then you have to get from there to wherever you're going. That's multimodal. Actually, no one company owns all of those steps. So we were looking at mapping out the touch points that people had, the kinds of information sources that they had, which things they were getting online, which things they were getting from signage. And so what you see here are 4 journeys. We organized them in some parallel, and we tried to, with these color-coded dots, identify when somebody was getting information from the phone app that they were carrying, when they were getting it from the sign that they saw when they moved into the airport, to see which gate they should be going to, when they figured out where the gate was by some signage, when they were told that it was delayed for an hour by an announcement. And you begin to see in these types of maps the variety of channels that you need in order to reach clients for a particular service. And by creating a system like this, where we could gather multiple examples, we could organize them in parallel structure, and then you could look at an individual journey, but you could also pick a stage, such as arriving at the airport, look across several people's experience, and see that they either were all having more or less the same experience, or actually there was quite a variety of experiences. So this is one example of how we put together experience maps. So with that, I will close, and thank you all very much for listening.
Yeah, that's probably, oh, there we go. That at least allows them to, okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you could show us this example, because we are going to be working on this. Everyone is going to do an experience map, and I'm delighted that you got out in front of the idea that there's a lot of different ways to do this. But the common thing is identifying all the touch points, as you said, or all the ways you can divide a large experience, like going from Paris to Boston, into a series of discrete episodes, or known in the language as touch points, and how wildly different one's experience might be at each one. In other words, in your example, let's say the airline seating is fantastic and the service is excellent, but baggage claim is a disaster and they lose your bags.
Yes,
And
I've had that happen, yeah.
But I mean, it's, I guess what it is, it's a way of breaking down something into, let's say, fixable components. What are some, in addition to we can go into this travel bit, I think maybe in a little bit, but can you give us a little bit of the range of the kinds of things that where you've journey mapped or experience mapped before? One is like the software business that we just saw.
Well, we use experience maps in most projects, and I said one of the keys is the notion of personas.
Right.
So you develop a persona by taking the information from your user research, trying to identify major types, but then trying to make it less abstract. Actually describing as much as possible the attributes of a real person that fit that type.
Right.
And then taking that person through the journey, saying to yourself, okay, Emily is 35 years old and her job is working in this doctor's office and she has these particular tasks to do and she has this level of interest or competency in dealing with computers and she has this level of interest in how the patients are doing, and you might have John over here, and he has slightly different attributes along those lines. He also works in a doctor's office, but he's devoted to his patients, and he's been working in this place for 20 years, and he's going to work here till he dies, whereas Emily's been working here for 6 months, and she doesn't really get to talk to the patients, but they're both doing the same job.
Right.
And you're building an application that will help them do their job.
Right.
Now, given the difference in their attitude towards their job and their understanding of certain parts, will this design work for both of them?
Right.
Will as Emily's sort of daily tasks are quite different perhaps than John's daily tasks, but they're both interfacing with this one program that you're working on.
So the goal there is empathy. The goal is to empathize with how different Emily's situation is maybe from John's, or?
Well, you need to empathize. Certainly a great deal of user interface design in general, and experience design in specific, is your ability to project yourself, your consciousness, your imagination into the minds of others.
Yeah.
To see it from other people's point of view,
Right.
whatever this it is.
Right.
The specific language you were talking about, touch points, journey mapping, I think the best definition of a touch point for the purpose of what you're asking the students to do is if you can think of whatever process or experience you're mapping as having let's say 2 parts. One part is this is the person who's going through the experience. This is what's going on in their mind. And then the other part is this is the business or service or environment or that they're moving through, and at certain points they touch. Right? So when you approach the MBTA system in Boston, there are certain touch points, and then there's other points where they're not really touching one another. One of the touch points is going through the turnstile. So that going through the turnstile experience is definitely a touch point for both
the traveler and the MBTA.
That's where the traveler is directly interacting with the system. The system has defined what you need to do in order to get through that turnstile, and you have to understand it and you have to live with it. Once you get through the turnstile, how you get to the platform and which train you get on, there's some touch points, but it's not quite the same level of touch point as walking through that turnstile. So identifying those moments and then recognizing if you're trying to improve the experience, what's the issue there?
Right.
Why is it that way? What kind of a system, and what are the costs for modifying that system, and what are the benefits for changing that system on the other side?
Well, that's a really good point about sort of understanding both sides of a transactional or experience relationship. So as the traveler, you guys were mapping your experience as the traveler. One could perhaps fruitfully map the experience of the airline, or maybe employees of the airline along that same route? Like, where is it? And you do come together at points, but you're not together at other points. I mean, on the MBTA example, all the work that goes on at the maintenance yard is not really, it's not a touch point for me as a commuter. It is if the train breaks down, I
Right.
suppose, but it's not a direct touch point in that same sense that entering the system is.
Right.
Using my
To bring it closer to, say, software application, you hear about an interesting mobile app, and either through word of mouth or through advertising or something, you go to the store, you go to whatever the Google store is or the Apple store, and you download that app. So that's one touch point. But that touch point is it's out of the hands of the company that's designing it. Mm-hmm. They have to follow certain procedures to be successful at that, but they can't really modify or brand that too much. Once it hits your phone, then there's a touch point at that point. You start the application up. What's the first thing that happens? If the first thing that happens is it asks you to type in a lot of information that you don't recognize has any relevance, mm-hmm. or it's not worth it to you to give them all that information just to get whatever it is you think this is supposed to do, that's an important touch point, and you would want to do the user research before you design that to identify, well, what are people expecting? Right. What seems, should I give my age? Should I give my this? Should I give my that? This seems to be connected. This doesn't seem to be connected. And then once you've done that, what kind of a response will reinforce people's understanding that they're on the way to losing weight, or they're on their way to a happier life, or they're on their way to whatever. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. They're on their way to understanding the music of this particular artist better, whatever it is whatever their expectation was for bringing that application in. So that's an important touch point, and then you could probably identify other touch points later on in the process, whatever the process is you're designing.
You're making me think that what we need is an understanding design app available in the App Store, but that's a conversation for another day. So, I would just want to reword a little bit some of what you talked about in your presentation, because it's, you and I talked before the class about the sort of design thinking mantra of empathize, define, iterate, prototype, and test. And when I was watching your presentation, especially in the example that you gave about Iverify, sorry. It's much better, yeah.
That's a test to see if you could remember the brand name after that short presentation. It'd be a great success.
Yes, well, so perhaps we'll edit the video, and I will come out with Iverify immediately with enthusiasm, and all will be well. But it did seem that the process you were describing fell very clearly into this basket of operations, which admittedly is a somewhat general one, but the idea that you have to empathize first. I mean, in other words, you have to understand the world from the point of view of someone else. You have to define what the problem is. So many, in my world, in architecture, these steps get skipped all the time. Mm-hmm. and you go straight to designing. I'm sorry, what problem are you trying to solve? I don't have time to address that. I've got to get right into the designing. And what I like so much about this kind of stuff is there is a fairly clear and rational system for doing it. So I'm assuming that this is a reasonably good outline or way of describing what you guys do. How, it seems that experience design has become much, much more extensive. Maybe it's all because of the web and applications and so forth. But do you think it's becoming more extensive? And then as a follow-up to that, do you think that the sort of experience design in the physical world is a follow-up on experience design in the digital world, or vice versa? We've talked to people from Disney and theme parks or Starbucks or the Apple Store, where people are studying a physically experienceable design as opposed to a digitally experienceable one. What I guess I'm asking is, when did the really mindful, aware business of experience, of thinking very self-consciously about this, did it happen in the digital era, or did it happen in the analog era before it?
That's a good question. I really don't know origin myths. Who came first? I think that one of the main things that's been driving experience design as a growing field is that it's relatively easy to produce really bad applications and websites.
Right.
We have all the engineering and the technology for churning these things out. And one of the main drivers for digital communication is advertising and brand identity. And so if you build an application based on advertising and brand identity, you can often create rather poor user experiences. That doesn't bother a lot of companies, but some companies actually have something that they want people to accomplish or do, and so they'll look at this and go, oh, maybe we should bring in an experience design company. Maybe this will improve the experience of our customers, and that will help. If you compare this to the Apple Store or to Starbucks, where every interaction that you have is more predetermined than many other types of stores, and the people are all trained to respond in a certain way and to be available to provide certain kinds of services to you. There's certainly an analogy there. Obviously, they're following a similar process. I guess since MadPow, the company I work with, and the other companies that I was part of before, we always limited ourselves or focused on digital experience design as we're designing what happens when a person is interacting with something that's running on a computer screen, whether that computer screen's in your pocket or on the wall or on your desk. You don't have the same kind of control over the environment that people are in than if you're working in a retail space or if you're trying to design not the educational experience for Northeastern, but the educational experience in this one classroom. We're doing one thing.
Right.
So I think it would be really interesting and challenging to have more opportunity to bring in more of the environment into the design.
Right.
But there's clearly a lot of opportunity to improve people's experience by just focusing on their interaction with that digital touch point.
Right.
And then focusing on what parts of that interaction are the most critical, which parts of the process are where you're going to lose people or win people, and shape it as best you can.
If I understood you just now, you said you thought that the people like at the Apple Store, at Starbucks, actually have more control over the environment than you do digitally. Did I get that right?
Yes.
'Cause I would have inferred the opposite, but and I would have guessed, and I don't know, and I don't do information design at all, other than maybe occasionally as a client. I would have thought that the degree that because the experience happens on a screen, that's such a finite thing, that maybe that experience design kind of grew because you could control a lot of the whole experience of, let's say, going to a website. Now I realize that because you know this world much better, the reality is actually a big company's website can actually be a minefield of different interests and so forth. But in unlike maybe a retail company or any kind of company that isn't as focused as Apple stores or Starbucks, it would seem to me that the digital environment is one where you could control and also get a lot of data. Like we're always our lives on Facebook and everything else are giant data fields now, where I guess our behavior is constantly tracked, and so maybe you get more evidence on whether the experiences you're designing are successful or not. Is that a fair thing to say?
So I think it's fair to say that potentially it's easier to gather information on people's interactions on websites and applications than it is in retail space.
Right.
That's really the distinction. Whether you can do something with the information you
that's a good
gather
point.
is another really interesting another interesting field. But I guess what I was driving at was, in my mind, when somebody walks into a Starbucks, the designer of that space has a pretty good idea of what they might want to do at that particular moment.
Right.
When somebody hits the Starbucks website, there's a broader range of things that may have brought them there.
Right.
And the same thing when you talk about the store. You know, when somebody's moving into the store, my favorite is IKEA. The IKEA experience, you know, the hardest working people in the world are the people who shop at IKEA. And they love it. They work so hard from beginning to end, and that was the first, in terms of history, that was the first store that I experienced where I recognized that I was being designed into an experience.
Yeah.
It's like I was being run through this pathway, and the reason I was being run through this pathway was they wanted me to do certain things before I made the purchase,
Right.
and that would affect my purchase, and then I'd come out the other end. And it was fun at the
Right.
same time,
Oh,
right?
there's
So
no more fun place to go.
how did they do that, and how do they maintain it?
Right.
That was and continues to be an interesting problem. The point you bring up about the data we leave behind. My favorite term for this is data exhaust. Came from some people that were working on some projects years ago at MIT, and they discovered that they could gather the data exhaust from people's mobile phones, and that gave them a lot of insight about the people. All of this perfectly legitimate at the time. But I think people don't, at this point, quite understand how much trace their interactions leave, and that as a designer, one of the real challenges that we have, and this is certainly part of experience design, is to become aware of that, make the client aware of that, and try and find what value is there in using that information to enhance whatever the product or service is.
This is so interesting because we had a guest last year in this course, Mark Meyer. He's a business professor here, and very good. And he gave a great presentation on the distinction between explicit and latent desire in the marketplace. And it seems that what is so powerful, and maybe what makes us so anxious about, let's say, exhaust mining or whatever one wants to call the kind of background mega data study, is that when the marketplace understands our latent desires even better, the distinction here between explicit and latent is much like we talked about at the beginning of the course with why people buy the vehicles they buy. The advertisements you see for cars and trucks on television have hardly ever anything to do with what the vehicles actually do. It has to do with who you aspire to be. Are you sexy? Are you a good parent? Are you a rugged individual in a Ford F-150? Are you something like this? And you'll notice, as we've noted in the first lecture, at the end of every automobile advertisement, there's a notice that says, please don't try anything that we've done in this ad with this vehicle, because it's under no circumstances should you do anything that we've done in this ad. And the point is they're addressing latent desire. They occasionally talk about explicit desire like storage capacity or something like that, but mostly it's who do you want to be, who do you aspire to be. It seems to me that this data exhaust and the conversations we're having, I would say culturally nowadays about data, access to data and security of data, has to do with revealing to marketplaces what our latent desires are.
That may be the case. I try myself to focus on I try and focus on a different application of the information. What the potential that I find really exciting is not the ability to anticipate that because you did this and this and this, you're probably more likely to buy white boots in the next 10 minutes than anybody else. And there are quants out there who've come up with algorithms that we'll discover later whether they're right or not.
They show up on the right side of my Google every day.
What I'm more interested in is using the information of how people interact with information to begin to anticipate what is it that they're most likely looking for and giving them that information as quickly as possible. So a lot of the designs that we do, I'm I'm sorry I don't have a specific example to throw up on the screen for you, but if you think about your own experience, there are times where you come someplace, you come to a screen, and then you go, okay, well, actually what I want to know is, here's actually an excellent example. Next time you're interested in going to a museum, you go to the museum website. Notice how many clicks you have to go through to find out whether that museum is open today or not. This is usually not what the marketing people want to put on the homepage. Right. And the marketing people generally run the homepage. However, when you search for that museum website in Google, a Google card comes up on the right-hand side of the search, and it tells you whether that museum is open right now or not, tells you when it's closing today, tells you what the phone number is to call if you need to call. And all of that is right there along with a map and a picture of the museum.
This is great.
They did that with people. They hired hundreds of thousands of people to produce those cards, but what they produced on those cards was data that they had elsewhere. They could pull that material together, and I think they had a clear understanding of what most people were looking for when they did a search like that. So I'm bringing that up as an illustration of what we try to do in other contexts with the applications we design. You want to, we say, bubble up. You want to bring up to the front the information that people are looking for rather than drawing them into it. Because a lot of websites are actually designed for you to get lost. Like, click on this, click on this, click on this, click on this. Forget what you were doing in the first place and look at this and look at this. And there's a business behind that. Like, the more page views they can get you to look at, the more they get paid for the advertising that shows up on it. And I'm not arguing with that business, but I'm much more interested in analyzing the problem, looking at the users, trying to bring the information to the users as quickly as possible. I'm going like, bring it up to a point where they can go about their business and get done what they need to get done.
Well, this is a great distinction because what you're, in the museum example, the marketing people, if you want the identity of the institution to be a grand place of culture. So the whole, I can't remember what the homepage of the MFA is today, the Museum of Fine Arts, but it may well be all Goya all the time, and it requires several clicks to get to this other thing. And so what you've shared is an apples to apples kind of comparison between solving one problem, which is identity, and another problem, which is empathizing with the user. And I think that's pretty clear.
And it's the kind of hard problem that we deal with all the time, because generally we have to solve both of them.
Right.
Not one or the other.
Right.
But I'm just bringing it up because in the process of doing those kinds of redesigns or solutions, we try and take all of that into account.
Right. That's fantastic. You're in the article and also in your example, I didn't realize that, or I didn't make the connection between the article that you shared with us and then your presentation about some of the very high-tech ways of mapping responses. In the articles you shared with us, there was stuff about eye movement tracking, I guess, for websites. Mm-hmm. How do you guys get involved in that level of testing in your company, or
we do a lot of user testing. If I say we don't do eye tracking, I'm probably wrong. If I say we do eye tracking, I probably can't give you a sense of how often we do it. Eye tracking is certainly not one of the major ways we gather data.
Right.
So if I could give you a description of how we generally do this in the user testing is we'll identify a sequence of tasks that seem to be the important ones for whatever it is we're testing. Mm-hmm. And then at certain points in the process of doing these tasks, we'll come up with questions that are verbal, but they're effectively multiple choice. Like, did you find that thrilling?
Right.
Obnoxious? I'd never do it again. And you ask them that kind of a quantifying question, and then you write that down, and then you go on.
Right.
So the quantifying questions give you some objective to compare, but primarily you're literally observing. You're looking at how people respond, and you're interpreting those kinds of responses. And that is why we capture video, and we share the videos with the clients so that we can look at that. There are techniques for, just like lie detectors, there's techniques for picking up changes in temperature and color and electrical on people's skin to see whether they're excited or not. I know there is a company in this area that is a spin-off from one of the other major universities that does just that based on facial recognition. And their main clients are people who are evaluating 30-second and 60-second commercials because in that particular art form, there's a time frame, there's a structure. You need to do this for the first 10 seconds and then this for the next 15 seconds. And based on whether you're doing this or whether you're doing this or whether you're doing this, they actually read people's expression and they give them rankings.
Right.
But that's, that's a very specific field. Generally, we're using some combination of observation, some quantification, and then simply identifying whether there's an area for improvement against some heuristics. Right? These are the principles that make for good design. When we come across something where this was, on this first screen, when you wanted to shake hands, you used your left hand. On the second screen, when you wanted to shake hands, you used your right hand. That's inconsistent.
Right.
Some people were confused by that. They offered their left hand, and then they realized they should offer their right hand.
Right.
You didn't need to make that distinction. Decide either right-handed shakes or left-handed shakes. That's based on certain heuristics.
Right.
And the observation would simply point out that these heuristics are valid. You see that some people were confused by that.
What would you say, you've been doing this for a while, can you give us an example of an experience that was dramatically altered to the better, by whatever criterion, through you and your colleagues' work? In other words, I'm thinking about, from an architect's perspective, there are some design projects that work out well, there's some that don't work out so well, there's sometimes when, let's say, a renovation, I'm trying to get something vaguely analogous, totally transforms what had been a completely dysfunctional place into people can't even believe it's the same building. Can you give us any examples where you guys were able to identify something in the research, in the testing, that gave you a problem that was solvable that nobody really knew about before? I realize this might be
That's a really good question. I wish you'd asked me that question before I got here, so you could come up with a really good answer.
Right.
I guess, in all honesty, more often than not, the answer is not exactly. And partly because often the work that we do isn't literally, the results of what we do is not necessarily what gets released.
Right.
And often the release is, in time, rather delayed from the time that we do the work.
Right.
And
And there are other voices.
And that really depends on the kind of organization you're working with and the kind of project that you're working on. When you're working with, and when I was working in France, I was working with a lot of governmental institutions. They often worked on an annual cycle. So you do some work, and then maybe a year or a year and a half later, the change would actually get implemented. So it was a little hard to say, oh yeah, we really knocked that one out of the park.
Right.
And then when you're working with some of the companies that we work with here in the United States, where things all have to be done in 5 weeks or 6 weeks, like the Iverify example, I don't actually know how much of what we did they used.
Right. Well, how do they, a client like that, like Iverify, how do they define success? You said a bit, you said, look, we want to have our prototype look more professional. We want it to look more fundable. But those are pretty, in some ways, somewhat squishy deliverables, it would seem to me, right? The CEO of Iverify, or there's 6 people, so there's one of them has got to be the CEO.
One of them is the CEO, yeah.
Says, we're going to hire you guys.
One of them is the head of engineering.
Right. In all organizations, everybody has to be head of something. So how do they, when they come to you, do they have a pretty narrow definition of success? Because for some of the other designers we've spoken to in this class have been really explicit about how helping their clients understand what the problem to be solved is part of the work. Maybe.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think in my experience, one of the most important and sometimes most difficult aspects of a project is even when you're involved in developing the project, you're involved in developing the proposal. Here's what we're going to do for you.
Right,
You explain to us what your problem is. Here's how we're going to solve that problem. And then the proposal is accepted, and then you start working on it. You need to, as often as possible, define what the goals of this project are. Mm-hmm. And that type of planning never really works out, but it's extremely necessary. Mm. I mean, I'll give you one dramatic example from years ago. In the 90s, the company that I worked with in Providence, we were involved in building many of the websites for biomedical publishers, for Science Magazine, for Nature Magazine, for the Journal of the American Medical Association. So in the late 90s, this was very cutting edge. People were publishing all of the medical literature online. It was appearing immediately. You could get it online before you could get it in print. And one of the goals that we had for building the Nature website was to make it easy for people to do this, make it easier for people to do that, added a series of features. And then and they figured at that time that maybe 10% or 20% of their audience were looking at the website. Mm-hmm. The rest were paying whatever thousands of dollars it was to be a subscriber to Nature magazine, and they were always reading it in print. Shortly after we finished the website, they published the article on the human genome. Mm. Well, that brought the website down completely. There were millions of people who were hitting the website that day to get that article. Wow. And in a sense, that was success.
Right.
But in another sense, it was embarrassing. This was supposed to be a great moment, but it hadn't really been part of the definition that millions of people should be able to hit this website in any one particular day. And it got fixed after that. Right. Faster than healthcare.gov, but it was a less complicated problem than healthcare.gov. Right. So those are the kind of shifts. The other kind of shift is the more you can define the problem that you're trying to solve, the more constructive ammunition you have when people from other parts of the organization come in and say, well, it also has to do this, or this is really important. And you can say, okay, if it's really important that this particular audience at this particular meeting be impressed by this, then we can do that, but that wasn't what we were doing before. Let's redefine the goal, and we can move on and do that also.
Some of the other guests have said something that really rings true to me, and that is that sometimes part of the deliverable is in fact successful communication within a large organization. So let's say I hire MadPow. I'm a mid-level manager at a giant company, Aetna Insurance or something, and I want a much better user interface for our insurance customers, but I also need to sell this within my organization, and I'm not as good at making presentations as you guys are. Can I include in our list of deliverables that you help me design the communication strategy within my organization, or is that not something you guys would do?
It is something that we do all the time. Mm-hmm. And I guess to follow on your question in a slightly different direction, often you're brought into an organization where one of the things you have to identify is what are they accustomed to in terms of design, and where do they see design fitting into the process. Right. So increasingly, a large insurance company, they may have recently created an experienced design department. That might be 2 people, it might be 40 people. Or there might be nobody. Right. If there's nobody, then you have to try to understand what are they expecting here? How does this fit? You know, this isn't the first time that they've done this. What did they do before? They hired an ad agency before? Okay. Then part of what we have to do is explain to them what the difference is between what they did before and what we're doing now. And as you were saying, the person you're working with, you have to understand what are her needs or his needs for communication. One of the most interesting things to me is working with a client and having them share with me the deliverables that they have received from other agencies over the years, because that gives me some insight into the variety of ways that you can communicate. If we had the opportunity, for example, to have a seminar where we had 30 different reports or strategy reports or design guidelines from 30 different agencies, we looked at them, you would see that there are 30 different approaches of one kind or another. And there's nothing, that's not bad, that's good, but you learn that different organizations have different styles. Some are more quantitative, some are more qualitative, some are more visual, that sometimes the visuals have relatively little to do with what they're actually doing, but they're visually interesting, and other times not.
Well, that really gets at another thing that is one of the core things I think in this course, which is that, you know, we have guests, almost each of whom does something different in the world than the previous guest. But they're also oftentimes in fields that overlap a great deal. It seems to me, and I you know, your business, and it certainly overlaps with branding, identity, positioning, business strategy. How many of those things do you guys explicitly say that you do at MadPow? Or do you say, we're experienced designers, and then we work well with these others?
Yeah, so the answer is, well, that changes all the time. And it's very market-driven.
Right.
And it's also very driven by the talents and interests of the people within your organization. So as we bring people in who have more talent in one direction than another, we try to develop their ability to use those talents by making people aware that we can do strategy design.
Right.
We do front-end development. We now do back-end development also. We've brought in a lot of back-end developers. So we have to change our own image to communicate that. These core talents of visual design, user research, experience design have been with the company from the beginning, and so they are central, but they're not necessarily central to every project. And we have had what I would consider to be business strategy projects, largely because of the relationship between someone within our company and the company that's hiring us. They're recognizing that this person could help us come up with the mobile strategy for this particular bank. They might also have gone to PricewaterhouseCoopers and gotten the same kind of a product from them, but they chose to work with us.
I was going to ask, I mean, do you find yourself ever collaborating with McKinsey's or you know, like more quantitative, financially oriented analysts, or with IDEO and Continuum, or are they just straight out competitors?
The latter, the answer is yes. I don't believe it's hard to imagine a project where we would be hired along with IDEO and Continuum to work on the same project at the same time. We've learned from things that they've done on some of the same projects that we've done, as I hope we all learn from one another. I'm on a project right now where I was just at a workshop where the facilitators for the workshop that I was participating in were from PwC, and that wasn't a matter of competition.
Right.
We could have done that also, but they were brought in to do a particular task in this larger project, and that was very constructive. We had to talk to one another and learn from one another.
Let me put the floor open for questions from the students. And do we have somebody receiving the Twitter feed today? Yep. Why doesn't that person come on up? I have some colleagues in the back row there with their glowing phones.
people whose job it is to look at their phone all the time.
Yes, it's a requirement of this course that you look at your phone constantly. Unfortunately, the students are excellent at complying with this strict directive.
So this wasn't on Twitter, this was an emailed question.
Okay.
But how do you make your design stand out in the digital world? There's thousands of websites out there, so what makes yours different?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is you as voice in
Me speaking as a voice for a team. I'm not speaking about my personal visual designs. You make them stand out by often, I'd say, in the work that we do, you make it stand out by decluttering, and these are terms that I hear the visual designers using over and over again. Cleaning a design, making it seem more compelling for a particular purpose, more essential to a particular task. I would think those are the best generalizations I can come up with.
It's actually a great, if I could interject, it's a great point. Some of the, 10 years ago, the home pages for a lot of corporate websites or even architecture websites or things like that were a giant to-do list. They just had millions of buttons on them. The idea was that you should be able to navigate anywhere from that page. And nowadays, I would say if you look at some of the really good ones, at least in my experience, they're almost completely clean. And it's maybe on the second page that you'll get more of the directory type stuff. Because the first page is about solving identity problem. Would you agree that that's...
Well, I would agree that there was a period when the general design for home pages looked like the chest of a Soviet war hero, sort of covered with all these emblems all over the place. Right. And the bottom line, what's the problem there? Well, the problem is that you come to a visual presentation, and rather than any coordinated design effort, you've got a whole series of designs that are competing with one another. So decluttering is trying to coordinate that and remove the unessential parts. For better or worse, Google has had a tremendous impact by sticking to one thing on a page and being the most successful website in the world. That certainly has turned people's attitude around. That isn't to say that everyone needs to go to an extreme like that, but I'd say the difference, there's a swing. It's not, personally, I don't believe in progress, I believe in cycles. And we're going through a period in a cycle where things are becoming more decluttered, but I'm sure we'll get back to market creep and things will start cluttering up again.
Yep.
There's also a lot more opportunity to do progressive disclosure and cycling of information, and rather than having to put everything there at the same time. So that's also helped a lot.
Right. Ellie?
In order to design within a certain budget, how do you prioritize problems you raise through information mapping?
The last part I didn't. In order to prioritize based on budget, how do you what?
How do you prioritize problems you raised through information mapping?
Through information mapping. Information mapping. Well, I guess one of the ways of doing that would be to collaborate with the team, so include the client in this. We often do this by doing a sort of one brainstorming session where you make a list of all the things that you want, all the features that you want in a particular application, or all the different. And then either you, through voting, often it can be done particularly if you have a large enough group, I say, okay, which of these is the most important? Which is the top priority? And this leads into another larger theme that people can probably find some good literature about, which is identifying the minimum viable product, or the MVP, as it is called in the business literature these days. When you're dealing with limited resources, limited budget or limited time, try to identify what is the most critical of the features, list them all out, make this a 1, make this a 2, make this a 3, and then look at the ones and see if we did the ones, would we have something people could use? And then we could do the 2 and we could do the 3. So that's often the way it's done in terms of the mapping. You might identify certain features that could be added, but we might show that if we don't have that, we can still get to here. We can still get to here.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I would add one other interpretation to that, I think, if I understood it correctly. Maybe if you map an experience, the question said information mapping, but let's say if you map an experience, not unlike the airport experience, you could probably identify the single most egregious negative, let's say, and focus your resources on fixing that, thinking that you could leave everything else more. If we got rid of that horrible baggage handling experience that resulted in your imprisonment for 24 hours and contracting a serious disease, if we could eliminate that, even if the others remain not perfect, we might be okay.
Yeah. Or you could turn it back around. You could say to United and American Airlines, because you charge people for checking a bag, this causes people to bring too much luggage onto the plane, which causes it to take a long time to get into the plane, which causes people to get into fights about which part of this, that's bad business. And they'll come back and say, well, actually we did an analysis, and the amount of money that we make from making them check bags and the amount of money that we charge them for being the first people onto the plane so they can put their bags it's good. It's good business, and I would say I think it's really bad business from an experience point of view.
Laura. Well, with that, Paul, I want to thank you very much for coming. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.